What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the June 17th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. I hope everyone had a good weekend, good Father's Day. And we're back with a 9-game slate today. Looks like a pretty fun one. We have a game in Coors Field. We have another Wrigley Wind game after yesterday's gave us a combined 3 runs. So we can go back to that if we want to. Should be pretty fun to walk through. It starts at 6:40 p.m. Eastern. So do keep that in mind. Don't get caught off guard not being ready to get your lineups in. Lock is about 25 minutes earlier than usual tonight. But 9 games should be pretty fun. And as always, we're going to walk through each game individually, looking at the top pitching, hitting, stacks, all of that stuff. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. This show will be there. We'll be here most mornings during the week. Schedule for me is still kind of up in the air at the moment, but starting to get things kind of solidified and nailed back down. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. As always, also throw your questions, comments in chat. I'll be happy to hit on whatever I see if I have an answer for it, whether it's slate specific, higher, just general DFS stuff, whatever it may be. Throw those questions in chat. And we're going to start things off with the St. Louis Cardinals taking on the Miami Marlins tonight in Miami. So we have a favorable pitcher's park. We have a very good pitcher on the mound in Sonny Gray. We also have Braxton Garrett going for Miami. Not a bad pitcher, but also certainly not on the same level as Gray. So far this season, Sonny Gray striking out 33% of hitters, 2.59 xFIP, 2.76 Scherer. Very, very good pitcher in a good spot against a weak Miami offense. The Marlins rank 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, only an 86 WRC+, which is tied for the third lowest mark in baseball against right-handed pitching. They have only been better than the Colorado Rockies and the Chicago White Sox. Neither of those things are very difficult to do. So sets up with a really good spot for Sonny Gray. About 21% projected ownership here at 10,500 on DraftKings. Showed up as optimal about 17% of the time for me. So ownership looks fine. Projection looks fine. Just looks like a good pay-up option in a good spot, both from a park standpoint and a matchup standpoint. On the other side, Braxton Garrett is relatively inexpensive at $7,200. He missed the beginning of the season with injury, but he's a solid pitcher. He put up pretty good numbers in the past. And then so far this year, a 20.5% strikeout percentage, 3.59 xFIP, pretty decent pitcher. Okay matchup against the Cardinals. This is a team that, of course, has a lot of right-handed hitters that have had success in the past. They are a little bit older. They have struggled a bit this year. They do only have a 19.6% K percentage on their active roster against left-handed pitching since the start of last season, but they also only have an 85 WRC+. Garrett doesn't look like a priority, but he does look like a viable SP2 option. Showed up as optimal around 10% of the time for me, projected for around 7% ownership. I don't expect either offense to look all that good because the park's not great. Neither pitcher is bad. The Cardinals are, not surprisingly, showing up more often than the Marlins are. Garrett just not as good a pitcher as Sonny Gray. But you do also just have favorable pricing on these St. Louis bats because they have struggled a bit this year. So you're getting cheap bats against Garrett. Mason Wynn probably leading off at 3,700. Arenado only 3,800 on DraftKings. Goldschmidt 3,900. While they haven't been as good this year as in the past, and this park isn't great, there is still obviously underlying talent at these salaries for the Cardinals, particularly at the top of the lineup. Herrera's got some pop at catcher at 3,500. So a cheap stack. You can build good lineups around them, but again, not a great matchup against Garrett. Certainly not a spot where you're expecting the Cardinals to go in and just light him up. He's not that bad. Since the start of last season, 190 expected ISO allowed to righties, so it does give up some power there against opposite-handed hitters. Sub 100 expected ISO allowed to lefties. Not surprisingly, you will prefer the right-handed bats here in the matchup with Garrett. But the big priority here looks to be Sonny Gray. Next, we have the Padres facing the Phillies in Philadelphia. Trey Turner is expected back today, I believe, for the Phillies. JT Realmuto is still out for about a month. For the Padres, we have Randy Vasquez on the mound. For the Phillies, we have Christopher Sanchez. Both of these guys have been solid pitching options at different times this year. Sanchez just having a pretty solid season overall, striking out about 20% of hitters, 3.14 xFIP. But this doesn't look like the spot that you really want to get to him against the Padres. Very, very difficult strikeout matchup. And you just have, other high-end pitching options on this slate. Randy Vasquez has been popular in several of his starts this year because he is consistently very inexpensive. Once again today, only $5,500. And I've said it many times that if you're a major league starting pitcher, that's too cheap of a salary. But that being said, this is a very tough spot against the Phillies. Good offense, even without Realmuto. tough park to pitch in, although San Diego, Petco Park has been tough to pitch in this year as well. But historically, this is a much better park for hitters than the home park for the Padres. And you probably just don't really need to get to Vasquez in this spot all that often on this slate. So you can see because of his salary, he's showing up as optimal at a higher percentage than his ownership. But when it comes to selecting the lineups that you're actually going to play, I wouldn't anticipate Vasquez actually being in my lineups all that often. The Phillies are going to look like a pretty interesting stack, I would expect, given that it is a good park. It is a pretty good matchup. I'm a little surprised, actually really surprised they're not showing up more. Maybe that changes by lock. I would hope that it does. They have one of the higher implied run totals on the slate. They're in a good park. Vasquez is not a great major league pitcher. He's allowed since the start of last season a 244 expected ISO to left-handed hitters. 151 to righties is certainly better. But Schwarber, Harper, both going to look good here. Bryson Stott looks fine. I think maybe one reason they're not showing up as much is they are expensive, and we don't really have pitching that we love paying down for on this slate. So it probably is going to be difficult to get lineups that you like that are getting, Harper plus Schwarber plus Stott plus, a couple other of the main pieces from Philadelphia. So maybe that's why the stacks aren't showing up as much as I expected. But it is certainly a team where if you can make it work, if you can find ways to get to them, then it is a good spot. Also, you have to keep in mind, we haven't gotten to it yet, but we do have the Dodgers in Coors Field. So when you are paying up for stacks, obviously that's going to be a priority spot. That's probably knocking down the Phillies a bit as well. And so you can see the Padres actually showing up a bit more than Philadelphia here. Ownership is pretty low on both of these teams. The Padres are just more affordably priced. Sanchez, like I said, not a bad pitcher. He's having a solid year from a run prevention standpoint. 153 expected ISO allowed to righties since the start of last season. Only 103 so far this year. His changeup has played really, really well against right-handed hitters. He's allowed virtually no power on that pitch with a 21% swinging strike percentage. So it's not a spot where you're looking at the Padres and saying that they are particularly likely to succeed against Sanchez, but it is a good park for hitting, and there is just reasonably priced talent in this lineup. If you look at the projected lineup, the only player on DraftKings above 5K is Fernando Tatis at 5,900. Obviously, that's warranted. He gives you stolen base upside in addition to being a good power hitter. Manny Machado with the platoon advantage against Sanchez, 4,900. Kim is relatively cheap. So neither of these teams look like priorities, but from a pricing standpoint, the Padres actually look a little bit easier to get to. I certainly prefer the Phillies if you can make it work, but the salaries are a little bit more difficult. Potentially going to look better on FanDuel. I didn't run lineups for FanDuel, but their pricing generally is a little bit softer, maybe going to be a little bit easier to get to Philadelphia. They are in a good spot if you can if you can afford them. Next, we have the Reds facing the Pirates in Pittsburgh. So a big park downgrade for the Reds. And then on top of that, they get a really difficult matchup against Paul Skeens. Skeens looks like the best pitcher on tonight's slate. He's only $9,500 on DraftKings, so he is less expensive than Sonny Gray. He gets a pretty good matchup against the Reds outside of Cincinnati. The Reds rank third in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 26.5%. 93 WRC plus is below average. And then Skeens, of course, is just already an elite pitcher. 35.4% K percentage since coming up for the Pirates in 6 starts. 30.8 K minus BB percentage, just far and away the best on the slate. 1.96 xFIP, 2.18 Sierra. You can certainly argue that maybe those numbers regress a bit since we are talking about a 6-start sample, but there's no reason to expect that Skeens isn't just one of the most talented pitchers in baseball already. He looks really, really good. You can see here that I think he is going a little bit over-owned ownership relative to optimal percentage. But again, you're talking about a pitcher showing up as optimal 30% of the time. You're not actually trying to build the optimal lineup in MLB tournaments because you're just going to cost yourself a lot of money trying to do that. So you're getting one of the highest probability play on the entire slate, and it's only taking up one spot in your lineup. So I wouldn't be surprised at all, even with him projected to go a little bit over-owned, if I am aggressively getting the Paul Skeens today and then just mixing in other pitchers as my SP2, depending on what I can afford, around different stacks and all of that. On the other side, Carson Spears, 6,600, not getting any ownership. I don't think he really warrants it. It's not a bad matchup against Pittsburgh in this park, but Spears only projects for about a 19% strikeout percentage, 4.5 to 5 FIP going forward. So below average starting pitcher and just doesn't really look necessary on the slate. The Pirates spot is pretty good going up against him, and they are affordably priced. So again, a little surprised they're not showing up higher as far as stacks go. It is not a good park for home runs, so that probably has something to do with it. But individually, I do like this $4,300 price tag on O'Neal Cruz. He is showing up as the best play in the game for me. He's showing up as the highest owned play as well. So I am on board with that. Gives you some power, gives you some stolen base upside, and he's just really affordable at 4,300. De La Cruz obviously gives you a massive ceiling, but does have that really difficult matchup against Paul Skeens. And you're not getting too much of a salary break for the matchup, given that he is still $5,800. Then you get back to some of the Pirates bats, whatever you can get to of Reynolds, McCutchen, Hayes. I don't have a problem with any of it. But again, this is a tough park to hit home runs. And you have to keep in mind that park factors, as far as like how they impact what you should be doing on a slate, it's all relative. Sometimes you get a slate where it's just nothing but pitchers parks, and so it doesn't really matter. But here you have a park in Pittsburgh where it is difficult to hit home runs on the same slate where you have Texas where you can hit a lot of home runs. You have Wrigley with the wind blowing out. You have Colorado. You have Atlanta. You have Angel Stadium. So you have Philadelphia. You have Toronto. You have a lot of parks on this slate that are hitter friendly. That amplifies the impact from a DFS standpoint of PNC Park in Pittsburgh not being a good place to hit home runs. Then going to the Rogers Center, we have the Red Sox taking on the Blue Jays in an AL East matchup. Relatively low total in this game. Yusei Kikuchi and Nick Pivetta, two high upside arms. Not great matchups for either one, but reasonable prices. $8,600 price tag for Kikuchi, only $8,300 for Pivetta. They look like secondary options, both of them. Kikuchi projected for about 27% ownership. He showed up as optimal about 20% of the time for me. Pivetta projects for about 12% ownership. He showed up as optimal about 13% of the time. Pivetta has struck out 29.6% of hitters this year, 3.24 xFIP. The strikeout stuff is very, very good, especially for this price point. He gives you a massive ceiling. The problem here is twofold. For one, Toronto is a very difficult team to strike out. They have an 18.3% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year. That's the third lowest in all of baseball, 101 WRC+. So you have a team in Toronto that is difficult to strike out. That's just naturally going to lower the strikeout projection for Pivetta on its own. But then the other thing to keep in mind is that while Pivetta does a very good job of getting strikeouts, he does also give up power. Left-handed hitters this year have a 204 expected ISO against him. Right-handed hitters have a 182 expected ISO. Pretty similar numbers if you go back to last season. So you have a park in the Rogers Center that is good for right-handed power. You have a Toronto lineup that has a lot of right-handed power. You have a pitcher in Pivetta that is very boom or bust as far as he gives up hard contact, but he also gets a lot of strikeouts. But he's going up against a team that puts the ball in play a lot. So it's not to say that he can't just go out there and rack up Ks. He still can, but it is about as difficult of a matchup for him as you can get when you think about what Toronto does well, what Pivetta does poorly, and sort of how everything blends together. So it is a scary spot, but in tournaments, at 12% ownership, there is certainly upside there. Kikuchi, so far this season, striking out 23.6% of hitters, 3.39 xFIP, good left-handed pitcher. Not the best matchup against Boston, but they do rank 7th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last year at 24%, 100 WRC+. You do have more ownership coming into Kikuchi. He projects a bit better for me than Pivetta does, so that doesn't really surprise me given that they are similarly owned. They're similarly priced, rather. So both of these guys look fine. From a salary standpoint, you're getting a bit of a break from like Sonny Gray to Kikuchi. But I would say that, salary included, it's like Paul Skeens tier 1. And then if you can get to Gray, great. If not, you're still getting plenty of upside from the secondary tier with Kikuchi and Pivetta. Offensively, if you want to get to either team in tournaments, I think that's fine given the talent that they have. But neither of them are showing up as high probability plays. You can see down here, Toronto and Boston both right around Pittsburgh in terms of all stack types. I mentioned the power that Pivetta gives up. If you wanted to target that, you can certainly look to like Vlad Guerrero. He did lose third base eligibility as well, also though. So it makes him a little bit more difficult to get to than he was for a couple of weeks when he had it. Obviously, Bo Bichette at 4,200, if he's in the lineup, is a perfectly fine play. I would throw him in like the O'Neill Cruz category, but Bichette is getting quite a bit less ownership. Same can be said for Boston. Kikuchi, not a bad pitcher at all. Boston does have some speed, stole 9 bases yesterday, the most they'd stolen in the game in franchise history. So you do get some of that upside, but only a 145 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters for Kikuchi this year. If you go back to last year, it jumps a little bit to 174, but it's pretty much just low-owned tournament plays here. Tyler O'Neill has a lot of power. Dahlbeck has pinch hit risk, but he's cheap and has MPE, assuming he's in the lineup. Same goes for Rafaela with shortstop outfield eligibility. Gives you some speed, can help, round out lineups where you're paying up. Maybe use Rafaela as a one-off. Maybe you like pair him with Dahlbeck and just get two cheap plays. But overall, there's not really anything to prioritize offensively here. It looks much more like a game to be getting to Pivetta and Kikuchi on the mound. Tigers are facing the Braves in Atlanta. Braves are favored in this one. Obviously, they have had some struggles recently without Acuna. You have Max Fried going for Atlanta, Reese Olson on the mound for the Tigers. Fried is 9,800, getting 25% ownership, only showing up optimal about 12% of the time for me. He is pretty much always showing up as over-owned for me these days. He's just a weird pitcher where I don't even necessarily think that I'm right, because he does do such a good job of working deep in the games. He's efficient. It's just very, very difficult for me to pay $9,800 for a guy that strikes out 22 to 23% of hitters that he faces, 3.23 xFIP, especially when he's popular. It would be a lot easier for me if he were getting 11% ownership to say, okay, well, I'm going to just pay for Max Fried here and he's going to be low owned. And if he goes out there and gives me a complete game, then I'm in really good shape. You're kind of just paying for 8 innings now. And when you think about who he's priced around, he's projected for more ownership than Sonny Gray is. Sonny Gray is more expensive by $800, I think it was, but he's getting more ownership than Gray. He's more expensive than Paul Skeens, and Skeens is getting quite a bit more ownership. But I would think that I probably just play more Skeens instead of getting to 25% on Fried at this price. So I've been wrong on him a lot. He's certainly putting together good games just because he is such a good pitcher and he can work deep into games. He does have a pretty decent matchup here against the Tigers as well. But I would be surprised if I am getting as much as the field is. I don't want to talk anyone off of it. Again, I've been wrong on him a lot. It's just somebody that I don't really get to at this price when he is popular. Olsen on the other side, 7K price tag, 7% ownership, 10% chance of being optimal. Perfectly fine as a last guy in. You have a stack that you really like. You have Paul Skeens. You have 7K left at pitcher. And you get to Olsen, whatever. 20% strikeout percentage, 3.77 xFIP. Not a great matchup against Atlanta, but there are some strikeouts in that lineup. Sixth highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 101 WRC+. So, last guy in, perfectly fine. I don't anticipate getting to either offense. Certainly not all that interested in the Tigers. You do see that I have them projected to be a bit under-owned, but still relatively low probability plays. You get that negative correlation with Fried as well, but he's just a good pitcher. He's not somebody that I really want to be getting to bats against. Sub 100 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters this year, 142 allowed to left-handed hitters. There's not a lot that's going to stand out there. The Braves certainly have more talent and have the better matchup, even though Olsen is not bad either, but they are relatively expensive for the most part. You have these other offenses in good spots that I want to prioritize paying for as well. Olsen this year, sub 100 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, 144 to lefties. So again, just a game offensively that I think is going to be pretty difficult to get to. Fried looks like the best play in this game. But again, for me, I would be surprised if I personally end up getting that much, just because he does grade out as being pretty over-owned in my stuff. So I would be surprised if I personally end up getting there. But I do think he looks like the best play in this game. If you take, I guess, my process out of it and where I think I'm going to end up, if somebody just said to me, who's the best play from this game? Who should I play first? The answer would be Fried. He does look good overall. Now, before we get to the Wrigley Win game, just a reminder that the Endgame Syndicate site is now live. That is the new site that I started with Uticow, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, focusing on giving intermediate and advanced strategy so that you can improve at DFS yourself, not be as reliant on other people. Or if you are, using public stuff, giving you some other ways that you can use it more effectively than you probably are right now. So I have some videos out on how I use Sims. Uticow has video out on things he looks for in MLB hitters that he thinks go unaccounted for. Nerdy Tenor has done a lot of game theory strategy stuff. Brick has done some stuff already on how to build your own ownership projections and actual projections. And we're around in Discord just talking strategy and all of that stuff throughout the day as well. So if you haven't already signed up for that, the link is in the description below. Be sure to check that out. Now, moving on to the Giants and the Cubs in Chicago. Wrigley Win game certainly was disappointing yesterday, where we got a 2-1 final, but we have the wind blowing out at around 10 to 15 miles per hour again today. So it looks like good hitting conditions in Wrigley. Jordan Hicks on the mound for the Giants, it appears. Javier Assad going for the Cubs. Neither of these pitchers are bad. Neither of them are great. Jordan Hicks, moving into the starting rotation this year, striking out 21.5% of hitters, 3.77 xFIP. Javier Assad actually striking out a higher percentage at 23%, 4.08 xFIP. Again, two solid pitchers here. Guys that generally you're not really looking to pick on, but you do have good home run weather in Wrigley. 179 expected ISO allowed to righties for Assad this year, 152 to lefties. Hicks has allowed a 142 expected ISO to lefties, 168 to righties. Neither guy getting much ownership. Both are probably going a little bit under-owned when you consider their talent level and compare that to their ownership. I think that as a last guy in, either of them are fine. But the problem is that they are priced in that same range with like Nick Pivetta and Yusei Kikuchi. So if you have a lineup where you have a low-owned stack, I would just play Kikuchi over either of these guys if you have the salary. Same goes for Pivetta. And even from an ownership standpoint, Pivetta is getting like 3 times the ownership of these guys, but he's still only projected for 11 to 12%. So you're already saving ownership by going to Pivetta, who does have better strikeout stuff than either of them. I think these guys are both playable if you're playing like a 150 lineup set in large field tournaments just based on their talent. And you do get some negative correlation with what will probably be 2 pretty popular stacks. But overall, I'm not all that interested in either pitcher. From a stacking standpoint, you can see the Giants showing up second most in all stack types, Cubs showing up 7th most. When you look at 5-man, San Francisco is 4th. The Cubs are like 9th. The Cubs did show up less for me yesterday than they ended up being rostered. So, maybe they do end up being a little bit more popular as well. But both of these offenses have high ceilings. Like I said, neither pitcher gives up a ton of power. Neither pitcher is bad. But if you get the ball in the air today, it should be carrying pretty well. Brett Wisely is cheap. If he's leading off, he's going to look like a good value play. Projected for about 13 to 14% ownership. Showed up as optimal 12% of the time for me. He's only 3K. He has second base and shortstop eligibility. So just a useful piece, especially on a slate like this where we have pitching we want to pay up for. We don't have a lot of cheap pitching we want. We have full stacks we want to pay up for. Wisely can certainly be useful whether you are full stacking the Giants or not. Matt Chapman, Patrick Bailey, they both look pretty good as well. Nice price tag on Bailey at $3,800 at catcher. From the other side, obviously Cody Bellinger, if you can afford him, looks good at $5,600 with multi-position eligibility as well. Then you get some cheaper pricing. Yastrzemski at $3,200, Talkman at $3,700, Soler at $4,400. Obviously, Soler does not need the help of the wind. If he hits the ball in the air, it's probably getting out regardless. But just a good offensive game in general. Not the best bats overall, but certainly guys that are good enough and in a good hitting environment at pretty good salaries. Obviously, guys get priced up generally going into cores. You don't really get a forecast far enough in advance for Wrigley wind pricing to become a thing. So a lot of times you do end up getting like the best value plays potentially here as opposed to cores because DraftKings and FanDuel don't know ahead of time that this game's going to have a 10-run total. Mets are facing the Rangers in Texas. Good park for hitting home runs, as I mentioned earlier. 2 offenses that certainly have plenty of power as well. David Peterson, 6K on DraftKings going for the Mets. John Gray going for the Rangers. So 2 decent pitchers here. It's kind of been the theme of the slate so far is that there hasn't been a lot of bad pitching. There hasn't been a ton of great pitching outside of a couple of guys either, but neither of these pitchers are bad. The 6K price tag on Peterson is somewhat interesting. He's only projected for about 7% ownership right now. Showed up as optimal 12% of the time for me. So not a priority, but somebody that I think if you do need to pay down for your SP2, isn't the craziest way to be different. If you're just trying to get to like the most expensive Dodgers and you don't want your one-offs to just be the same ones that everybody else is playing, like Brett Wisely from the last game. Peterson at 6K is a little bit underpriced based on talent. He's only made 3 starts this year. He hasn't been any good. He's only struck out 8% of hitters, but he made 21 starts, 27 total appearances last season, through 111 innings. He struck out 26% of hitters last year. The year before that, he struck out 27.8%. So this is a spot where he is priced at 6K mostly because he's just been so bad through 3 starts this year. But it's pretty clear that his talent level is better than we've seen so far this season. And so, he's underpriced. He should probably be like 7K or 7,200. Not advocating for just like jamming him into lineups, but he is a pretty interesting value play if you happen to need it. John Gray on the other side, 7,900, getting 9% ownership, 9% chance of being optimal. Looks completely fine to me. 24% strikeout percentage so far this season. Not a huge priority here. Not a great matchup against the Mets. 21% strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, ranks 19th this year. 108 WRC+. They are also getting a nice park upgrade going into Texas. So that's why he doesn't look better. He also only threw 65 pitches in his last start. He threw 37 in the one before that when he returned from injury. I would expect that you're getting like 80 to 85 pitches, something like that today. He probably throws enough pitches that at 7,900, he's capable of giving you a pretty good game. I doubt that he's got a long enough leash that he can put up a score you absolutely have to have. Like, I have no idea, assuming that he's not just going out there and throwing 100 pitches today. I don't know how John Gray gives you like a 28 DraftKings point game or anything, but certainly still alive to be giving you, 17, 18, maybe, gets a win bonus and gets you into the low 20s. So I think, like I said, 9% looks completely fine to me. Offensively, either of these teams are perfectly fine secondary plays. They're not going to show up the same as the Wrigley teams. They're not going to show up the same as Coors, but it is a good park for home runs. Over the last 3 seasons for both sides of the plate, Texas has the 3rd best home run park factor behind only Cincinnati and Dodger Stadium. So it is a pretty good park to be getting to bats, even though neither of these pitchers are bad. Ownership here, for the most part, is pretty low. 8% coming into Lindor. Looks like a good shortstop play. Obviously can be a relatively difficult position to fill, especially on this slate in particular. The Orioles aren't playing, so you don't have Gunnar Henderson. Ellie De La Cruz is facing Paul Skeens. Mookie Betts has a broken hand, so you don't have him. So it just makes Lindor that much more valuable. It makes him look that much better. Francisco Alvarez, only 3,400. If he's in the lineup at catcher, that's a cheap power bat in a good park at a position where it's tough to find that. So he looks pretty good. Ezekiel Duran, third base shortstop, 2,700. He's projected for the most ownership here at 11%. That certainly is something that could change by lock just because you get value elsewhere that isn't projected right now. But he is probably a little bit underpriced. Goes without saying that you can get to Seager, Nimmo, Martinez, Semien, any of these guys, Alonso. It's just a pretty interesting tournament game, I think. None of these guys are the best, the highest projected guys on the slate. None are the best point per dollar plays, but they're all just sort of like that 3rd or 4th best option, which makes them go a little bit overlooked, I think. Then we get to the game that everybody's going to be trying to get to. Dodgers taking on the Rockies in Coors Field. James Paxton going for the Dodgers, Cal Quantrill going for the Rockies. So we have not very good pitching in this game. Quantrill, I think, is actually better than Paxton at this point. Obviously, Paxton has the much better track record, but a 1.2 K minus BB percentage for Paxton this year, only striking out 13.8% of hitters, walking 12.5%, 5.44 xFIP. Quantrill striking out 17.2%, 4.41 xFIP. So 2 pitchers that are likely to let you put the ball in play in a park that increases batting average on balls in play because of how big the outfield is. I don't think there's any real reason to be getting to the pitching here. The offenses are obviously what you're going to want to be getting to. The Dodgers are showing up as the most used stack for me. Colorado is 3rd when you look at all stack types. When you look at 5-mans, the Dodgers are still 1st. The Rockies are 5th. Pretty similar if you look at 4-mans. So obviously, game we're going to want to get to offenses. You see a lot of ownership coming in here as well. A lot of 10 to 20% owned guys, and that's for the most part, I think, where everything should be. Obviously, $7,000 price tag on Shohei Ohtani is wild. I don't think we've seen $7K on a hitter, at least as long as I can remember, but still showing up as optimal like 16% of the time. Still showing up or projected to show up in about 21% of lineups. That really just tells me that it's not that difficult to build lineups and still have Shohei Ohtani and still have Paul Skeens. So still looks obviously like a really good play in this spot. The nice thing, or the thing to keep in mind, and it's obviously if you're using optimizers or sims, it's the work is done for you. But just with the way scoring works in baseball, this is not like NBA where maybe they make Luka like $14,000 and it's really tough to get to him because then you have to find value elsewhere. With the way scoring works for hitters in baseball, you can pay $7K for Ohtani. If he hits a home run or, home run, double, or steal or something, he's still a really good value. And then you're just going to have guys that cost $3,500 and hit a home run, and they're great values too. So it's just still not difficult to get to Ohtani here. That's reflected in the optimal percentage. It's reflected in the projected ownership. So he clearly looks really good. You have some cheaper bats on the Dodgers that are not the best hitters, but they are cheap in Coors on a team with like a 6 to 7 implied run total. Miguel Rojas, Gavin Lux, Kevin Biggio, if he's in the lineup, Jason Hayward, all less than $4,000 on DraftKings. They are not the most exciting individual hitters, but they do positively correlate with guys like Shohei Ohtani that obviously are very exciting plays that you want to get to. They help you afford getting them into lineups as well. Freddie Freeman, Will Smith, Teoscar Hernandez, obviously guys that you do want to get to here. Now, it is worth keeping in mind that while Quantrill doesn't strike out a lot of guys, he doesn't give up much power. Only a 119 expected ISO to righties this year, 154 to lefties. But again, this park is just so good for hitting in general. And guys like Shohei Ohtani, I don't really care how much power the opposing pitcher gives up. It's Shohei Ohtani. He generates it on his own. He's just going to do damage against anyone. I will just take him putting the ball in play and see what happens. For Colorado on the other side, not as popular as the Dodgers, still getting some ownership, and I think that they should. I mentioned it before, but Paxton, just by any metric I look at, appears to be completely washed. Obviously, industry projections, any good projections in general, are going back more than one season, or in this case, half of a season. So he still projects as sort of competent, but there's nothing about him that looks good to me this year. The only positive thing I could say is he still isn't giving up a ton of power. Only a 169 expected ISO to righties, sub 100 to lefties. He's walking a lot of guys. That's not the most conducive thing for scoring fantasy points, obviously. But it is still Coors Field. It is still a Rockies team that is very affordable. They're facing a pitcher who hasn't been any good in Paxton. So I don't mind getting some of these Rockies either. Obviously not the same priority level as the Dodgers, but also generally lower owned. And then finally, we get another good hitter's park and another big-time offense here. The Milwaukee Brewers taking on the Los Angeles Angels in Anaheim. So again, good hitter's park, really good offense for Milwaukee. But we do have some injury issues, or a injury issue in particular with them. William Contreras is day-to-day. If he's not in the lineup, they become less appealing, because one of the big reasons that the Brewers end up looking like appealing stacks is that you have one of the best hitting catchers in baseball in Contreras. If he's not in there, it just makes the stack look a little bit worse. It does also make the stack cheaper, though. Jose Soriano is going for the Angels. Carlos Rodriguez going for the Brewers. Soriano has been solid this year. He's projected for about 9% ownership, showed up as optimal 13% of the time for me. He has struck out 20% of hitters, 3.8 xFIP. He looks fine at 7,500. Again, just kind of a last guy in, very similar, I think, to Reese Olson, where I'm not actively targeting him, but this price range, the pitchers below 8K, just really aren't that exciting. There's a bunch of guys that are just fine, but they're in tough matchups or whatever. So Soriano certainly in that bucket. And really the same could be said for Rodriguez. He's only 6,300. He's getting 13% ownership. Showed up as optimal 9% of the time for me. I think technically I would like to just flip Peterson from the Mets and Rodriguez, play if I were playing completely optimally, 13% Peterson and 9% Rodriguez, while the field does the opposite. But really, they just look like the two best complete paydown options for me. I'd rather get to them than $5,500 Vasquez. Rodriguez doesn't project as a great pitcher at this point in his career, but he is cheap enough here that I think he's playable if you do end up needing to pay all the way down. The Angels are much better against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. That's been the case all year. It's been talked about a lot that they have done a really good job against left-handed pitching. Rodriguez is a righty. The Angels against right-handed pitching this year, 22% K percentage, ranked 16th, only a 95 WRC plus. So again, tough park to pitch in, not a great pitcher, at least at this point in his career, but he is cheap enough that I don't mind rolling the dice if you really need the savings. Offensively, I don't mind getting to either team just because they are in a good park. Milwaukee showing up a bit more than the Angels, as you would expect. That is also with Contreras projected in, though. You can see that he's showing up as the second highest utilized guy from Milwaukee behind Bryce Turang. Turang 4,700 at second base, Contreras 5,400 at catcher. The two most used guys for me, followed by Adames. If Contreras is out, how often I'm getting to Milwaukee probably does just drop because of what I was saying before, where Contreras is a very appealing part of a stack, and then you lose that. Obviously, if he's out, Gary Sanchez, though, would still, assuming he's in the lineup, still be a high upside catcher bat that is less expensive. So still, getting to the middle of this order and Turang at the top in this park at pretty low ownership is not a bad spot to be. The Brewers are certainly a team like Texas, like the Mets in Texas, where you can take advantage of the talent that they have because you're going to have so much ownership funneled into Coors Field. You're going to have so much ownership funneled into Wrigley that you still have a good hitter's park here, a team with a lot of offensive upside, and just 5% ownership really across the board. So I do like the Brewers as a tournament stack. Angels, same case, just not as much power as the Brewers. They are projected for around 5% ownership or less on most of their guys, 3 to 5% chances of being optimal. So relatively low probability stack, but they are facing a pitcher getting a little bit of ownership in Rodriguez. They do still have some power here. So secondary stacks here in this game, I do prefer the Milwaukee side to the Angels side. So that's all 9 games. To recap, Paul Skeens, pretty clearly the top pitcher on the slate. Fully expect to be prioritizing him. Salaries included: Kikuchi, Gray, Pivetta, I think the next tier for me, Max Fried is somebody that I probably won't get to, but I'm not telling you not to. Just not somebody like I said, not somebody that I get to a lot at this price, but I am also wrong on that a lot. He's certainly playable if you can find the salary. And then your sub 8K guys, there's nothing that stands out as great, but any of Soriano, Peterson, Hicks, Olson, Garrett, Rodriguez, just kind of usable if you need to get there. Offensively, the Dodgers very clearly the top stack on the slate. San Francisco, Colorado look good as well. Cubs look good. Wrigley win game. As far as the stacks outside of Coors Field and Wrigley that I think I like getting to, I think both sides of the Texas game are interesting because it's such a high upside park, 4 home runs. I think the Brewers are very interesting at pretty low ownership as well. Phillies, I would say, but they are pretty expensive. So I think the Mets, the Rangers, the Brewers, pretty interesting teams. If you're not going to Wrigley, you're not going to Coors. So that's all I have for you in this one. Thanks for checking it out. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. And if you're in either the Endgame Syndicate Discord or my Dub Club Discord, I will be around throughout the day to talk the slate. So just hang out in there if you want to. But thanks again for checking out the show, and good luck on your lineups tonight.